Encryption at rest is a fundamental security requirement that protects stored data from unauthorized access. Even if an attacker gains physical access to the storage, Azure provides several encryption mechanisms that allow you to protect your data without the complexity of custom key management solutions. What is encryption at rest, by the way? Encryption at rest ensures that your data is always encrypted when stored on disk, which prevents unauthorized access in case of theft or compromise. Azure uses symmetric encryption, which is AES 256, to encrypt data quickly and efficiently. Let's unpack how it works. Data is encrypted when written to storage using data encryption key, which is called DEK. The same DEK encrypts data when accessed. Encryption keys are securely stored using Azure Key Vault or Microsoft Managed Keys. And KEK, which is key encryption keys, add an extra layer of security by decrypting DEKs, ensuring control access to encryption keys. This encryption protects against data theft, compliance violations such as like a HIPAA, PCI DSS or FedRAMP, and unauthorized physical access. Let's understand how you can encrypt the Azure VM disk using Azure Disk Encryption. Azure Disk Encryption is designed for infrastructure as a service virtual machines and provides full disk encryption using BitLocker for Windows or DMCrypt for Linux. Using ADE, you can encrypt the OS disk and data disk of Azure virtual machines. ADE uses Azure Key Vault to store and manage encryption keys securely. ADE supports customer managed keys for full control over encryption. And ADE works alongside Azure Backup to encrypt backup data. When to use ADE? You can use ADE if you need full disk encryption for Azure VMs. You can use ADE when you want control over encryption keys with customer managed keys. And you can use ADE if your organization has compliance requirements for data encryption. Note that ADE only supports VM-based workloads and requires Azure Key Vault integration for key management. ADE is a bit complicated process. To secure managed disk without VM changes, you can use encryption at host as well. Encryption at host is a security feature that encrypts data before it's returned to Azure managed disk. Unlike ADE, which encrypts at the VM level, encryption at host ensures that all data stored on the physical host is encrypted. Let's unpack the features of encryption at host capability. As mentioned, encryption at host encrypts data before it is returned to Azure managed disk. You will notice no performance overhead as encryption happens natively. It uses Azure Storage Service encryption with customer managed or Microsoft managed keys and works for all managed disk snapshots and images. When to use encryption at host? You can use encryption at host if you need encryption for managed disk without modifying your VMs. You can use encryption at host when you want seamless encryption for virtual disk without using ADE. And you can use encryption at host if you are using services like Azure Kubernetes Service that rely on managed disk. Note, encryption at host cannot be used with ephemeral OS disk and does not provide full VM encryption, unlike ADE. Let's discuss confidential disk encryption, which provides enhanced security for confidential computing. For highly sensitive workloads, confidential disk encryption protects data even when it's in use, not just when it is at rest. This is designed for Azure confidential computing environments such as confidential VMs. Let's unpack the key features of this capability. Confidential disk encryption encrypts data at rest, in transit, and in use. Confidential disk encryption uses confidential VMs with hardware-backed security. Confidential disk encryption ensures only authorized application can access decrypted data. And confidential disk encryption protects against malicious insider, compromised OS, or hypervisor attacks. When to use confidential disk encryption? You can use confidential disk encryption when handling highly sensitive data, such as like for financial, for government, or for healthcare. You can use confidential disk encryption if you require data encryption even when it's actively processed. And you can use confidential disk encryption for workloads running on confidential VMs with hardware security guarantees. Note, confidential disk encryption requires confidential computing infrastructure. To mention, this is not available on all VM types. And confidential disk encryption may introduce performance overhead due to added security measures. Bottom line, in summary, you use ADE for full disk encryption on AS VMs with customer control keys. You use encryption at host for seamless encryption on managed disk without modifying VMs. You use confidential disk encryption for ultra-sensitive data that needs encryption in use. And you store encryption keys in Azure Key Vault to manage access securely. By implementing the right encryption strategy, you ensure data protection, compliance, and security best practices across your Azure infrastructure.